For those of you who don't know much about us, we are an ecosystem builder for nature-positive, regenerative cities. Our mission is to raise awareness of the critical role nature-based solutions play in building urban resilience, tackling climate change, supporting biodiversity, and enhancing human health. We also spin out from RegenIntel, for those of you who are familiar with them. We are London-based, and we host regular in-person and virtual events spotlighting nature-based solutions and regenerative innovators. Our in-person events are typical educational, interactive outdoor experiences. Last year, we hosted an event in partnership with Terradu and Sugi, where we toured some of Sugi's urban pocket forests around London. And this year, we've got a number of upcoming events in the pipeline with the Biofy Project, Citizen Zoo, Terradu, and the Fresh team. And we'll be posting many more events in the coming months. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. The session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube afterwards. The format for today is a 40 minutes fireside chat, followed by 10 minutes Q&A. And we have our wonderful support team from Regen City. So Ben, who will be keeping an eye out on the chat. And before I hand over to Angela, we will be giving away a copy of Dr. Nadina Galle's book, The Nature of Our Cities, to one lucky attendee today. The winner will be selected at random from those of you that have asked the question. So over to you, Angela.
Thanks, Kat. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Dr. Nadina Galle. She's an ecological engineer, researcher, and author of The Nature of Our Cities, Harnessing the Power of the Natural World to Survive a Changing Planet, which launched last year. She's the brilliant mind behind the Internet of Nature framework, championing this global movement of integrating technology with urban ecological health to create more resilient, nature-positive cities. She's a columnist and opinion writer for major outlets, including the New York Post, and hosts the Internet of Nature podcast, which features global innovators reshaping urban ecology. So we're incredibly excited to have Nadina join us today. We'll be exploring key insights from her book, delving into some interesting case studies from some of her favorite stories from her research and her book. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Nadina Galle. Thank you so much for joining us, Nadina. Before we kick off with our discussion, though, I feel like we've got a really nice mix of in our audience today of people from various climate communities. So I'm curious to do a pulse check before we start. So we're going to do a little audience experiment. Kat, would you mind sharing this Slido? So if you could, I think Ben's going to input the Slido link in the chat. So when you think of the city you live in, what comes to mind? So if everyone could do a poll, and we'd love to see. So concrete.
The first one immediately too. Oh, good. Okay, we got some balance
great.
here.
Urban forest, parks, infrastructure, traffic, busy, pollution, traffic. But parks comes up, green. Pollution's a big one. So yeah, it's interesting to see the words that immediately come to mind when you think of the cities you live in. Yeah, so I think for a lot of us, the urban experience is often associated with challenges like pollution, traffic. But it's nice to see some people say green, pocket forests. Okay. Great, thank you for that. So let's keep those words in mind as we delve into the discussion with Nadina. So I finished reading your book recently, and it's so beautifully written. You're a fantastic storyteller. So aside from it being full of interesting information from your research, the book is structured in a way that sort of like weaves in personal stories and is very narrative driven, which made it such a compelling read. So to start off, I would love to hear love for you to share with the audience today a little bit about your journey, what sparked your interest in the intersection of nature, technology, and cities, and what was there a defining moment that shaped your career and your research, and ultimately what led you to write the book?
I would love to. And first off, thank you so much to Angela and Ben and Kat and the Regen City team for having me. I know Angela, you reached out, I think it was 6 months ago at this point, that you had read the book and that you'd really enjoyed it. And that's always such a thrill to get, because what more is an author's dream come true, to hear people reacting positively to the book and that it's inspired them, and that they want to host an event around it. So thank you for having me. It's a real privilege. And thank you also to all of the visitors here. We've got almost 50 of us live here. So thank you for spending your valuable time in this hour with us. And hopefully it'll be an hour well spent and you'll walk away with lots of different inspiring ideas. So as Angela said about the book, I had always wanted to be a writer. English was always my favorite class, my favorite course growing up at school. And I actually applied to go to journalism school when I was 18. I'm Dutch originally, but I grew up in Canada in southwestern Ontario in a city now called Waterloo. And I wanted to go to Toronto, the big city, and go to journalism school. I grew up watching the news and broadcast journalism, and I looked up to so many different, journalists, both written and on television. And I was like, well, that's what I want to do. I love communicating. But unfortunately, I was waitlisted at the journalism school and I never got in. So my parents were a little bit worried and they were like, well, you should probably come up with a plan B. And that plan B was the outdoors, because that was my other big love, was nature and spending time. I grew up, spending a lot of time in the forest, going camping, do a lot of those, stereotypically Canadian activities, which I loved. And it was very, very different from the Netherlands when we go and visit back family. It was a very different, childhood in many different ways. And then I thought, okay, outdoors, what's that called? I guess it's called biology, because that's what I know from high school. And it wasn't until I got to university that I discovered something called ecology. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a whole, environmental science and ecology. You could study that. And I love that too. And I have a lot to thank for a first year professor that kind of led me on this, what ended up being a decade-long academic journey. And I'm very grateful for that, because when I'm looking back at my 18-year-old self, with these big ambitions to be a journalist, like I really didn't have that much to write about, right? Like how much do you really know at 18? And I'm really grateful that I had all this experience and understanding more about how our Earth functions, because I think that's a big misconception that we got a lot of time when we have these discussions around climate change, around biodiversity loss. We often are having those conversations without a true understanding of how the Earth and ecology function. So I really believe having that foundation in environmental sciences and ecology and ecosystem thinking is so integral to a lot of my thinking today. But that love and that zest for writing and understanding the world through writing was always there, and that always remained. And I got a chance to do a lot of that during my studies. Was always involved with the local newspapers and the campus newspapers, and doing all, kind of exercising that writing muscle, because it is a muscle that you have to keep exercising. And when I finished my PhD, I had always gotten the critique, you could say, because it was meant as a critique from a lot of peer reviewers in a lot of my academic articles, that my writing was too creative. They didn't like that in my academic articles I referred to soil, for example, as the biologically active skin of the earth. They were like, that's a little too much for a journal. And I was like, oh, I love communicating in this way, because I just feel like it carries that kind of narrative driven writing. It carries stories a lot better. And I do believe through good storytelling is how we share good ideas. And I always kept that in the back of my mind. I finished my PhD, defended my PhD online, unfortunately, in September of 2020. So at the height of COVID. And I kind of was like, well, now what? I was supposed to start a postdoc at MIT, which is where I was doing the latter part of my PhD research. I was supposed to go back there for my postdoc, but that wasn't going to happen anytime soon because of COVID. And I was like, well, I know what it's like to be at MIT now. I'm not going to do an online postdoc and expect to get the same experience. So I started what many people did during COVID, which was a podcast. And that was the best decision I ever made, because I missed the opportunity to have a lot of those live interactions that you would either do on campus or on the work floor or at conferences. And I started having all of these conversations through the Internet of Nature podcast. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that there was so many great stories to tell here. Arborists that were frustrated by something and discovered a certain sensor that could help them. The public landscape manager of a city that was frustrated that the city was facing so much deforestation and technologies he turned to. A concerned citizen that saw deforestation and a loss of nature and things that she did that did things in her own community to kind of green those natural areas. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of stories here that never really had a place in academia, and they definitely had a great medium for the podcast. But I was like, I think these are the stories that would go really well in a book. And then I thought, what if that could be my next big project? So that's in January of 2021. I decided this is going to be the year that I write a book. It took until October of 2022 to get a book deal. That was a very long process, and then it finally came out in June of 2024. So it was a long process, but it's one that I would do all over again.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing your journey to date on the book and how you came to start writing it. And I think a huge part of it is this term you coined, the Internet of Nature. So for those new to the concept, how do you define it, and why is it so crucial for the future of our cities? I'd love for you to unpack that a bit for the audience today.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I did originally want to call the book The Internet of Nature as well, just from a branding standpoint. I thought that'd be smart. But there's still my publisher, which is HarperCollins, was a little bit worried that that wouldn't appeal to as much of a broader public. And to your point, Angela, about it being so narrative driven, this book is really not meant to be an academic book. Of course, it's rooted in a lot of research, and I bring the notes and bibliography section is quite extensive, but it's really meant to be stories that almost written like a fiction novel, something that's really enjoyable to read, that weaves in both people's stories that I interviewed as well as my own journey through a lot of this, and gets quite personal at times as well. And the Internet of Nature, of course, remains really the thesis, the central theme throughout the book. And it's this idea that we are living in modern times, in a modern world, in modern cities. And at the same time, we're coming to this massive realization that we are desperately aching to have a reconnection with the natural world, and that piece of nature is so often missing in our cities, and not just for our own public health and our own physical well-being and our mental well-being, but also it's a key concept when it comes, and foundation really, when it comes to climate resilience of our cities. So it's all of these things together, right? It's economy, it's climate, it's ecology, it's biodiversity, it's mental health, it's physical well-being, it's longevity, it's children's development. All of these different facets come together. It's safety. All of these different things come together, and all of them have one thing in common: is that they all get better when nature holds more of a place in our cities. So if we accept that to be true, and there's decades now of academic research that shows us that nature is really integral in our cities, then what does that mean in the modern world? And how do we get nature back into cities? How do we create new nature? How do we better prevent or protect existing nature? And I believe that modern approach has a role for modern technologies. And a lot of people, when I started talking about this idea during my PhD, my PhD dissertation was also titled Internet of Nature. So when I was developing these ideas for my PhD, there's a lot of people that kind of like get the goosebumps when you put nature and technology in the same sentence. And I believed it was really exactly that reaction that was preventing a lot of nature being better established in our cities. And we had seen, and we continue to see, these massive technological revolutions when it comes to our healthcare, our democracies, our social media, how we vote in our cities, how we deal with lighting, with pollution, with waste management, with mobility. And all of these different things have undergone a technological revolution. But the urban ecology, the very foundation on which our cities are built, have been continuously left behind in that digital revolution. So a lot of this thinking started with this idea to bring nature online. And this idea, this name, Internet of Nature, is on the one hand kind of this tongue-in-cheek reference to the Internet of Things, which is one of the most ubiquitous technologies within the smart city movement. And at the same time, a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that Earth already has its own version of the internet, this biological communication network that connects 98% of plant life underground. And the Internet of Nature is essentially this sub-classification of emerging technologies specifically designed to map, monitor, manage urban nature. So it's a management tool, but also most importantly, technologies that regular citizens can use to actually reconnect with the natural world. So you can kind of put Internet of Nature technologies in those two different buckets. And I've been on a journey to not only discover what those are, and I think I've discovered some 150 different applications of it so far. Many of them in the podcast and in the book, some of them more developed than others, some still very early days, some, maybe already a decade into their development and their application. And I continue to be on a journey of the best medium to share those stories with the world.
Thanks. I think zooming out a little at Regen City, part of our mission, and you touched a lot on this actually when you were talking through it, it's like a lot of our mission is to raise awareness of the fact that nature-based solutions has the potential to multi-solve. And there's so many co-benefits of having green infrastructure embedded in city planning. So I loved this quote that you, from your book, like a conductor leading a symphony, nature directs the flow of activity and connection between people, places, and creatures. And like you mentioned, on the flip side, there's also that dichotomy between nature and technology and the argument around whether nature and technology can actually coexist. So I think this segues quite nicely to, why do cities need to integrate technology with nature-based solutions, and what are the biggest opportunities that can be unlocked in this space? And also, I guess, would love for you to highlight some of your favorite stories and use cases from the book. Like what are some of the most exciting real-world applications of Internet of Nature today, and any standout projects that you want to showcase. Would love to get you to share with everyone today.
For sure. Yeah, I'll just answer the first part of your question, and then I'll have some visuals as well that I can show the audience to kind of highlight some of these ideas that I'm most excited about today, because that changes daily, to be honest with you. So to answer this question of why do we even need to apply and deploy technology in this space, and I think the simple answer to that is that we can't afford not to. Despite that there is huge, I would say, growth in also the mainstream media when talking about, green infrastructure, natural flooding mechanisms, trees instead of air conditioners, right? All these things that we're seeing more and more of in the mainstream media. Despite all of that growth, I think in general terms, we are seeing a loss of greenery year over year in the majority of the big cities and small towns around the world, right? And that I was a little bit, when the publisher came with the title, The Nature of Our Cities, I was a little bit wary at first, because putting cities in the title for me immediately gives this indication that this is only about the central business districts of the Londons and Parises and New Yorks of the world. And that is absolutely not what this is. This is just as much about the central business district as it is about the outer fringes of our cities, because the majority of this growth is actually happening at the fringes. We are not just seeing a great urbanization, we're seeing a great suburbanization. And we're seeing that in ways that are incredibly unsustainable. But there's also massive opportunities there, because the majority of our urban infrastructure that we need in the coming 20 to 40 years hasn't even been built yet. So if we can leapfrog a lot of the errors that have been made in the past, we actually have this massive opportunity to do things differently. So we can't afford not to, right? Because we're seeing a lot of losses of green space. The thing is it's not happening on public land. It's typically not happening on lands that are owned by municipalities. One thing that a huge misconception that people have around the urban forest, for example, which is all of the trees that are within a city's limits, whether they're in the public right of way, whether in cemeteries, on school campuses, on our streets, in backyards, all of those trees together make up the urban forest. And typically around 50 to 70% of the urban forest is actually on private lands, which means that the municipal government has very little say when it comes to protecting those trees and those lands. So as you can imagine, that's where we're also seeing the majority of losses. And the problem of that is that you can't see a lot of these things. Often they're hidden, they're happening in backyards, they're happening on private lands that you might not have access to. And that's exactly where technology can help us gain a better understanding of what's going on in those areas, so we can do a better job at protecting them. And that, of course, gets into a lot of the property. And I know, especially in the States, in Canada, less so, but in the States and in Europe, definitely less so. But in the States, that's a huge discussion that we need to be having between private and public lands. Who owns rights to the trees and the natural spaces on those lands, and how do you do those things in a way that that feels fair and that makes sense to people. And the other thing that I would say is that when it comes to using technology to engaging people more with the outdoor world, like that really gets a lot of people quite, I don't want to say angry, is probably too strong of a word, but probably a little bit sad, right? Like, how have we gotten to the point that we now need an app to nudge people to go outside? Why do we now need an app, to identify different species? Why are we now at the point where little kids under the age of 8 are able to recognize hundreds of different logos of different corporations and not even able to name or to identify, based on the leaves, 10 native tree species? And to that, I say that is sad. And I hope that that is a driver that we can change this and be better at this. But to completely ward off technology, I think we're losing a lot of potential opportunities to meet people where they are. And I always kind of relate it to a dating app, right? Everybody wants to find their one soulmate in life. Well, maybe not everybody. Most people do want to find their one soulmate in life. And if you do that through a dating app, you want to make sure at some point that connection, that first interaction, goes offline. And I see a lot of these apps, whether it's an app that's literally aggregating the amount of time you spend indoors versus outdoors and nudging you to get outside, or whether it's an app that is gamifying children's connection to nature and giving them little scavenger hunts to do out in a park and fill those in, then put the phone away, then get their next assignment through the phone, or whether it's an app that's helping you to ID different flora and fauna species. If that app is going to help you make that step to make that connection, so that then you spend more time in those natural spaces, and at some point you forget the phone even existed because you're having so much fun out there and you're enjoying so much out there and you're seeing all of these different co-benefits that it's having, then why would we not allow technology to play that role? The majority of people are glued to their phones anyways. Why can we not show people that it can be a tool for good in many ways? And I think that's the thing when we have this conversation around technology, smartphones, and the rise of AI. I think we often forget to talk about, technology is in our hands. It's a tool for us to use. And when used in a responsible and ethical way, I think it can drive a lot more nature engagement and a lot more awareness, because we cannot expect people to exhibit any kind of pro-sustainable behavior, pro-environmental behavior, if they don't have a connection with the natural world. It begins with spending and making daily habits of spending time outside. So if technology can meet people where they are, then I think that's a good step to be taking. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. And then what I can do is I can share my screen and kind of get into the nitty-gritty of some of the examples. Let's see here. You're seeing that okay there, Angela?
Yep, I can see it.
That all looks good. Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spend a little bit of time and just quickly introduce you to some of the characters, and there's many, but some of the characters that you might meet within both the podcast and the pages of the Nature of Our Cities. For some of these, if there's a corresponding podcast episode, I've actually included a little QR code up in the top left corner there. So if you're interested in learning more, you're welcome to follow those. And if you miss the QR codes, it's just nadinagalle.com/podcast for all of the different episodes, and nadinagalle.com/book if you're interested in the book. So Cecil Konijnendijk. Cecil Konijnendijk is a name some of you might have heard of. He's an urban forester, a global urban forester. He works internationally, and he's gained a lot of traction in recent years because a number of years ago, he came up with this very simple but scientifically robust concept of 3-30-300. This idea that if we know that green space and having trees close to our homes is so important, how do we actually go about quantifying that? How do we know we have enough? So he, as an urban forester, came up with this rule of 3-30-300. The idea is the three: every person living in an urbanized setting should be able to see 3 trees from their home, 3 decent mature trees from their home. So I want you to take a moment and think of, let's say, your bedroom window or your front door. If you stand there and you look out, how many trees do you see? The second part of the rule is 30%. So 30% tree canopy cover in every neighborhood. So this typically was a metric that was used in traditional urban forestry to measure essentially tree canopy cover. For those of you that aren't familiar, if you imagine a satellite image and you're looking down on a city, how much of the aerial is tree cover? If it's 30%, great. It's more than 30%, even better. If it's less than 30%, then you're in trouble. Typically, they would do this tree canopy cover analysis for the entire city. But the problem that's wrong with that, and that's why it says here in every neighborhood, because you might have, right, a city that has a huge park and a huge urban forest on one side of the city. So in total, that city might have 30% canopy cover purely because you've got, that big park, that big urban forest that's compensating for the whole city. But we need to bring that closer to home. We know that the majority of people's lives are made up within, the commute that they take to their work, to school, where they drop their kids off, to the different activities where they go grocery shopping. Life is made up of those small moments. So we need to also bring nature into those small moments and bring it closer. And the third part of that rule is 300 meters. So you need to be within 300 meters of a decent sized park or green space. So 330, 300. What I love about this rule is that it has this system of checks and balances in place, right? It's not just about, can we hit 30% canopy cover from an entire city? It's also making sure that it's not just only about trees, it's also about parks and green space, and making sure that we're bringing nature as close as possible to every person's home that lives in a city. Now, Cecil has done a great job at also getting into the media. So what I was saying before, that this idea of urban forestry and nature-based solutions is getting more and more mainstream traction. I think we have a lot to thank to Cecil and his 330-300 rule, because it's made it, again, simplistic for most people to understand, but at the same time scientifically robust, which is so critical to having these conversations. Now, the thing is, when we talk about what it takes to actually measure a lot of this and understanding where each of these trees are, we look to something called a tree inventory. So understanding that a tree inventory is really the basis of any good urban forest master plan, right? It truly goes back to the age-old adage, you cannot manage what you don't measure. The problem is that the majority of tree inventories around the world are done by a fellow like this, right? In the field, looking at the different trees and having what used to be a pen and paper, now a tablet, and taking down recordings of that tree, the location, so where it is, its condition, the species, the age, all of these different characteristics that give us a great idea of how each individual tree is doing. Except you can imagine that if this form of taking a tree census was done for every single tree, in an entire city, by the time that you've tracked the last one, the first one you tracked is probably out of date, because this is going to take you years to do. So there's a company called Greenhill, together with Davey, that's working on something called smart tree inventories. And they're not the only ones, but they're definitely the ones that are leading the way in this. And essentially what they've done is they've adopted a LiDAR, so a terrestrial LiDAR, which is a scanner that looks like this. Essentially what it is it is giving you, it's LiDAR, meaning that it uses lasers to measure what's around it. So you can't see these. So it's an invisible laser, and it's basically just measuring the distance from the sensor, so from the car. But you could also put this on a backpack if it was an area like a park where cars couldn't get into. And it's measuring the distance from that scanner to whatever it touches first. And then what Greenhill has done is it's created an algorithm to basically mask out everything except for the trees. So you're going to get something that looks like this, right? It's a 3D model. You could call it, you've probably heard the word digital twin being used. It's basically just a digital replica of what you see around you. And it is an incredible way to objectively measure the trees that we see, at least on the street level, right? Because of course it has its limitations, being that it's a scanner on top of a car, but it's an incredible way to at least get a metric and an objective measurement of the majority of our trees in a city. So it's giving you a lot of information, right? It's giving you the size of the tree trunk, the diameter at breast height, which is typically something that you would measure in the field. It's giving you an accurate idea of the crown. So the crown of the tree is where the leaves are, the crown height and the crown width, which can give you an idea of the volume of that crown. That crown volume is really critical because that's where a lot of the benefits are coming from. So how do we know this? Well, there was a software, a software suite that was developed by the USDA Forest Service. It's called iTree, and this was developed many, many years ago. And what iTree has done, essentially, it takes that field data that was originally done by people on the ground, measuring the different trees. It takes that, combines it with different data, and essentially what it does is it gives you an estimate of those trees' benefits in monetary value. So this is really critical because now we're speaking the language of municipal planners, urban planners, and property developers, right? Because property developers like to talk about money. And if we can show that trees are incredibly valuable, not just in terms of, how much energy savings they have, but also in terms of public health benefits and how much we can give a real estimation. And that, I think, is what's truly missing a lot of the times from conversations that we're having, and why we're seeing year over year greenery loss every single year is because we're still not able to properly communicate the value that trees and other green areas and natural spaces offer us in cities. So this is one way to do it, but this doesn't work. iTree doesn't work. You're never going to get good outputs of iTree unless you have good inputs. So this is providing us with a way to get much better inputs. Okay, so that's great. So we've got all of that. We've got a great way to measure it. We've got a great software system to put it in, right? So this all sounds great, but what does it really mean, right? What does this really mean for the future of our cities? Well, it's providing us a way to actually move and transform the definition of what success means within urban forestry. So in typical tree accounting, we talk about this idea of you basically, you look at your tree accounting, your urban forestry management team says, okay, what have we done this year? And then someone says, well, we removed 100 trees, but we planted 200. So on paper, that sounds really good, right? Because you've got a net gain of 100 trees. But in reality, the situation is quite different, because what that also means is that you may have removed 100 fully grown, mature, very old, a lot of co-benefit providing trees. And you've then gone and replaced them, not with fully mature trees, but with saplings, stems, maybe max 5 to 10 to max maybe 15-year-old trees. And it's going to take decades for those trees to provide the same benefits, to provide the same habitats, not to mention all of that's been lost already, right? And I could do a whole deep dive just on that alone of what is lost when we lose those kinds of trees. So what's incredible about this technology is that we are moving this definition, and we're actually providing cities with the cost-effective tools to actually do this. So instead of looking at the success of urban forestry in terms of stems removed and stems planted, we're now moving this definition of success to the amount of crown volume that's grown every single year. And what this does is like the city of Woerden, which is just outside of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, you completely flip that definition of success on its head. So instead of looking on paper and seeing, okay, this is how many stems we've lost, how many stems we've replaced, you can actually say, hey, our crown volume has increased by 5%, 10%, 20% year over year. What that actually does is it incentivizes the better management and care of the existing trees that we have. And it actually provides people with a way to measure this. So people always think that it's very weird that I don't immediately say, when people say, okay, what is the one thing we could be doing? A lot of people expect me to say, plant more trees, plant as many trees as you can. I'm actually the first person to tell you, yes, you can do that. But as a first step, I want you to see what trees there are already existing and what are the measures that we can do to make sure that those trees live to be 100, 150, 200 years old. Because you're much better having 1 or 2 huge, big, mature trees on a street than you are having 10 little ones. And this is proven both in public health and well-being research, but it's also shown in climate, because again, the benefits are within that crown volume. So the more that we can incentivize growth in crown volume, the better it is for the city as a whole. And I'd be happy to get into that more if there's interest. I'll share one more example with you, and then I'll give it back to Angela. And that's with Allison Young. So I mentioned in the beginning that there's kind of these 2 buckets that you can put Internet of Nature technologies into. The one is this management bucket, which the smart tree inventory definitely falls under, the use of LiDAR, using these different software suites. It's a management tool, right? It's helping both property developers better monetize the values of our trees, and urban planners do a better job at protecting them. The other bucket is how can we actually use these new technology tools to actually reconnect people to nature? And Allison Young and her colleague Lila Higgins, who's the woman with the peace signs up, they did just that when they developed the City Nature Challenge almost 10 years ago at this point. And the City Nature Challenge is something that happens all over the world. And I would actually invite you to visit their website, citynaturechallenge.org, and see if your city is participating this year. It's happening this year from April 25th to 28th. I'm actually one of the co-organizers for the first time bringing the City Nature Challenge to the Dutch island of Curaçao in the Caribbean, where I'm based some of the year. And it's this incredible opportunity to use your smartphone for good. Essentially what it is a 4-day bio blitz. So the public, and this is a way to get people that typically don't spend a lot of time in nature, in the natural world, involved, and getting people outside with a shared purpose, right? If you're not someone that does a lot of hiking or walking or has a dog or has kids, someone that's naturally spending a lot of time in nature, this is a great way to get you out there with a purpose, get you out there with a reason. To do this with your colleagues, do it with your class, do it with your friends, do it with your family. And essentially what you do is in 4 days' time, you take out just your phone and you observe as much wild flora and fauna as you can. You take a bunch of pictures and then you upload those pictures of each individual observation to the iNaturalist app, which is free and free for download, Android and iPhone. And you upload those. And those observations are then validated after this 4-day BioBlitz, are then validated by experts, naturalists, scientists. And together you're forming this crowdsourced biodiversity map, which most cities kill to have, but would never have the resources to be able to get something like this. So as I mentioned, the very first City Nature Challenge happened in 2016. So this year will actually be the 10th anniversary. And it started as this friendly competition between Allison and Lila, because Allison is from the California Academy of Sciences based in San Francisco. And Lila was from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. So it was this fun little rivalry between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And then it grew and it grew just outside of California to the US, to Mexico, to Canada. And now in 2025, their 10-year anniversary, they're expected to have 1,000 different cities taking part this year. It's truly incredible. Just to get you an idea, give you just an idea of the scale of these things. In 2024, there was nearly 2.5 million observations worldwide. 65,000 species were identified, of which nearly 4,000 were rare or threatened species. And around the world, 83,000 people took part. Imagine that. Imagine an army of biodiversity soldiers, which I call them in the book, that are going around and that are identifying, right? It's so fun because it's not just a way to get people outside and get people combating this idea of plant blindness or animal blindness, this idea that, yeah, we might spend time in green, but we're just seeing it as a green facade. We're not really seeing it for the true living creatures that we're sharing all of this with. And it's providing this amazing crowdsourced biodiversity database. Of course, there's a role for artificial intelligence here too. You see it a little bit here with the Sylvia warbler bird here, which essentially there's a computer vision algorithm within the iNaturalist app that helps to identify a lot of these species, which, first thing about AI, the more you use it, the better it gets. So this is providing a way to also essentially create, biodiversity data that never existed in the first place in places where municipalities, would never have the resources to be able to do this. And there's no better place that really prove the impact of the City Nature Challenge like La Paz in Bolivia. So La Paz is the administrative capital of Bolivia. And I got the chance to visit last year during last year's City Nature Challenge to produce a documentary about the success of the City Nature Challenge in La Paz, which has been crowned the winner of the City Nature Challenge for the past 3 years in a row. The reason being is that they've gotten nearly 100 different institutions involved. So we're talking about nearly every single high school, every university, every college, all of the big environmental NGOs involved in this. The City Nature Challenge is such a thing in La Paz, and they're so proud of it, the fact that they've been also named the global winner 3 years in a row, that there's even advertisements in buses with the dates: take part in the City Nature Challenge, download the app, go outside, even if it's for a couple hours during, one of these 4 days, and identify as many species as you can. Now, that's what I'm doing here in this picture together with 10-year-old Olga, who has taken part in the challenge every year with her mom since it started. And just to give you an idea of some of the crazy discoveries that come out of this, in the top right corner, you see a photo of this endemic blueberry bush. That blueberry bush had not been had not been recorded in La Paz in over 100 years. A high schooler made an observation of it, uploaded it to iNaturalist during the City Nature Challenge. And the other one was, the picture below is the Bolivian snake, which, unlike its very common name, had not been seen in La Paz in over 40 years, had not been recorded. Ecologists had been searching for it, had not been recorded. It was seen and observed and uploaded by a high school student. So this is like, I could go on and on about how incredible this initiative is. But I'll just leave it at that. But I would definitely encourage you to check out citynaturechallenge.org, see if your city is participating this year, participate during those 4 days, April 25th to 28th. And if your city is not participating, consider becoming a co-organizer or an organizer next year, because that's what I've been doing this year. And it's such an incredible way to feel like you're really doing something helpful on the ground, not only getting people outside, but also creating this beautiful crowdsourced biodiversity map.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those interesting insights and some of those really cool applications. I think that I love the City Nature Challenge as well. I think Regen City are trying to organize a little event around that with some key partners in London. So something to look out for. And I think, I don't know, like that the iTree application and how I think you wrote it in your book, for every dollar spent on tree planting care, the tree provides like 5 times that in benefits. And I think that was something that bit of a penny drop moment for me. So yeah, I think.
Yeah. I would just add to that. One of the things I love about that story is that happened in the time of the Michael Bloomberg administration in New York City. Which, for those of you familiar with Michael Bloomberg, is that he's an investment banker, and he stacked his administration with a lot of business people, investment bankers, people that like no other can really appreciate an ROI, a return on investment. And being able to, through the iTree software, being able to prove for the first time, and they did New York does a volunteer run tree census every 10 years. And I write about that in the book as well, because they're going into their 4th edition now in 2025. They've been doing this since 95. And seeing this decade jump in technologies that they're using every 10 years has been so interesting. And I end that chapter because I did this interview with Fiona Watt, who has been running the tree census for 35 years almost at this point. And she, we kind of start talking about, okay, what's next for 2025? And she's like, well, have you heard about this thing called terrestrial LiDAR, which is just what we talked about with the smart tree inventory. So it's interesting to see these conversations happening. And with that very first tree census, they were able to put it in this first iteration of iTree that came out. And then they saw this incredible return on investment, which was indeed, as you said, Angela, every dollar that was spent on urban forestry had about $5.60 in terms of returns. Well, and when you bring that kind of information to someone like Michael Bloomberg, who can really appreciate a return on investment, that ended up leading to the 1 million tree campaign in New York City, which to this day has one of the biggest successes of urban forestry, that has been very, very volunteer run, and a way to really to showcase the value of trees and bring it into the main course in a city that otherwise really valued its skyscrapers and other kinds of non-green infrastructure.
Wow, yeah. I think that also kind of brings us to, because I see a lot of positive based off of the applications and stories you've shared, but what are some of the main barriers you find to scaling these types of solutions in cities? If you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a couple that I'll just touch on. One is still this lack of trust in technology, right? That's a big thing when there's different barriers for the different audience I'm talking to. So when I talk to an audience of mainly tree carers, tree surgeons, arboriculturalists, urban forestry management professionals, there's a big fear that a sensor, which might tell them when and where to water a tree, or taking a measurement using terrestrial LiDAR versus them doing it themselves on the ground. There's a lot of a lack of trust there in the technology. Could technology possibly do what I'm doing? And there's also a real fear of being replaced. And I think, and I look to Josh Bohonic, which is he's one of the senior development managers at Davy Tree Research Group, who always says, and I quote him in the book, technology will not replace arborists, but arborists who do not embrace technology will probably be replaced. I kind of butchered that. That's not how he said it, but you can understand what I'm trying to say there is that technology is not going to replace people, but it can take away a lot of the tedious work that is already not being done at the level that it should be doing, right? And I think this is spoken, and Josh Bohonic runs part of the smart tree inventory program. So a lot of that is really embedded in what they do. Is it's trying to scale up work that simply we do not have enough people to be able to do. And this data is so critical. But there's a certain sense of trust there that needs to happen. And that's just going to take time. And that's going to be a lot of different case studies. That's arborists from, a big respectable cities like the city of Santa Monica, for example, which has, long had a gold standard when it comes to urban forestry, coming out and saying the reason why we have the gold standard, the reason why we're able to do this is because of these technological innovations that are really helping us. And if we didn't have them, we would have been lagging behind. And because of this, we're able to stay on top of different things. It's stories like Deerfield Beach in Florida that after suffering a really bad hurricane, we're not able to get FEMA funding, which is emergency funding, which they offer by the federal government after a natural disaster. We're not able to get it because they didn't have a tree census, they didn't have a tree inventory. So they weren't able to prove that a lot of the valuable trees had actually been lost. So that just takes time, but that trust is a really big thing. And I'm always very, what's the right word here? You just have to be, I've done this work myself. So I've been out in the field, I've measured these trees. I understand a lot of the problems that people in the field are coming up against. But you have to be very understanding that a lot of these people have been in this field for 40, 50 years. They have a ton of knowledge, and showing them that ways that technology can not replace them, but optimize their work is not something to be scared of, it's something to be really excited about. And it's also a way to take a lot of that knowledge that they have in them, that often that knowledge dies when they retire, as a way to actually put down that legacy for other people to learn from in the future. And I think when you bring it in that way, to actually say, this is a way that we're actually going to scale up the knowledge that you had from spending 50 years in the field, that's really exciting. Because I think anyone who's been in this field for that long and that is nearing retirement age, that's a real fear, right? And we're already having labor shortages in this area. So showing that this is a way to scale up that knowledge and transfer it down to next generations of urban tree professionals is really exciting. And then one other barrier that I'll say as well is making sure that we don't become too reliant on it, right? So adding on that point, I talk about this with Richard Louv in the last chapter of the book, which is Raising Future Naturalists, which is all about understanding this, this disconnect between children and nature and what that does. And Richard Louv he coined and popularized the term nature deficit disorder, which is this generation of kids having an indoor childhood presenting symptoms that look much like ADHD, but it was in fact NDD, nature deficit disorder, not spending enough time in the natural world, and being very concerned about that. A lot of people paint him out to be anti-technology, and I got a chance to ask him about this in person. He's like, I'm not at all anti-technology. I think actually that we need to have a better balance with it, because it's not about being anti one thing or pro one, about being anti technology. It's more so about being able to show that we can actually raise this next generation of kids to have what he calls hybrid minds, this idea that they are deeply comfortable in nature, that they're always challenged, they're spending so much time, that they're problem solving and learning to be more empathetic out there, but also digitally natives, right? It's not about creating a generation of Luddites that don't have anything to do with technology. There's no such thing as going back to nature. That time has passed. It's about coming to this beautiful merging of the two, and that does exist. And I think that rubs people the wrong way, and that can make people uncomfortable. And he always says, immediately when you feel like you have your phone out, when you're out on a hike and you have your phone out, is technology adding and augmenting that experience, or is it detracting from it? And we all know where that boundary is. Some people might have, varying degrees of where that boundary is, but we all know that there is a boundary, and it's up to us to feel when that is, and take action, both with ourselves and our children when that boundary is hit.
I'm just conscious of time, so I think would love to hear your before we move into Q&A, we've got a bunch of really interesting questions come through. Would love to hear what your vision is for 2050. If we get it right, what does an Internet of Nature city of the future look like in 2050?
Oh, I think it's a city that I kind of describe at the epilogue of the book, where this kind of role of technology has become almost invisible, right? It's working behind the scenes to help manage a whole system of um, man-made wetlands to help with our wastewater management and our flooding mechanisms. It's helping water newly established trees where they need it. It's helping to make sure they don't get water when they don't need it. It's helping to make sure that people are spending enough time outside. It's a whole network that we no longer have nature-based schools or outdoor schools. Every single school is like that. It's no longer a luxury to have a rooftop garden where you can have lunch with your colleagues. All of the office buildings have that built into them. It's this idea that we have been able to put away these apps that remind you to get outside, because every time I drop my kid off at school, or I'm going grocery shopping, or I'm commuting to work, I've already quadrupled, tripled my goal of getting 120 minutes of nature exposure a week in that one day, because that's just what the layout and the design of nature in my city is, that it's so deeply woven in the urban fabric. I don't even have to attempt to do it. This kind of broader understanding of nature having more of a place where, we have older people, younger people teaching things. Did you know you can eat this species? Do you know that this tree species has actually it existed at the time of dinosaurs? Like, having this more deeply rooted understanding of nature built into our kids' education, and also built into how we spend our pastimes. That instead of always going for drinks for our friends, we're going for hikes. Instead of going to faraway places on these nature retreats, we can actually do this within the city limits. Instead of having to travel far away to see 5 different constellations in the night sky, we can actually see those in our urban environment. So having a deep connection to nature that everybody feels and is interwoven in our daily fabric. Technology helped us get there. Some technologies still may exist in 2050, but the ones they do, they're operating invisibly.
Great, thank you for that. I am now going to move to Q&A. There's quite a few questions that's come through. Mary Stevens asks, agree with lots of this about tech as enabling, but there are also questions of power and control. Who owns the data and what are they doing with it? How do we make sure this isn't the next wave of enclosure, with big tech ultimately extending its control into remaining commons? Do you want to take a stab at that question?
I can definitely try. I think it's very important, and I brought it up briefly when I used the words responsible and ethical, because that's a large part of this as well, and that's why I love something like the City Nature Challenge. Those observations go to observation.org, to iNaturalist. They're completely open access. They're going to something called the Global Biodiversity Database, which is able to be accessed to everyone, not just to scientists, not just to academics. That information is available, and we can see patterns and interesting things from that information. One of the challenges with that, though, is something that we're facing here in Curacao. Curacao has a species of rare cactus, which has known to have very healing properties. It's very, very interesting to pharmaceutical companies, and there's a lot of fear with local naturalists and ecologists that providing the locations, because in order to have your observation count for the City Nature Challenge, you need to have your location services on so that it can count within the limits of that municipality that's taking part, is giving way to the location of these species. And that's when I think it becomes, all of these different things need to be adapted to the local context, right? I'm here to inspire and show different ideas that have worked around the world, but every city, every community, every resident is going to have different considerations. So in this consideration, it might mean not recording those observations, not showing people the locations of those areas, because the local naturalists have seen that that's a real danger. So I think that's something that we need to be very aware of. We need to build in data protections from the beginning. And we also just need to be highly, highly cognizant of the local context, which is going to be different everywhere we go.
I think we've got one more question we can do, and then we're going to have to wrap up. So Caroline Bolstra, thank you for the inspiring presentation. I wondered, as in many cities, trees and green spaces more often are located in higher income neighborhoods. How can we use technology to make sure green spaces become more equally distributed across cities and can benefit people from lower income neighborhoods as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the technologies that I write about in the book comes from a company in Oregon in the US called Nature Quant. And what they do is quite literally in the name, they quantify nature. They developed essentially a map, which is called Nature Score, which gives you which is basically, it takes data sources from a bunch of different places. So yes, satellite imagery, but also land use maps, Google Street View, air pollution data. And it basically provides you can do this right now. You can type in any address in US, Canada, and Mexico. It's coming to Europe in 2026. And you can basically get an idea of how well your place, your residence, your house does in terms of its nature score. Some of you might be familiar with something called walk score. How walkable is your neighborhood? Well, how much nature do you have in your neighborhood? And this map was being used by the former US administration to actually see where they should be intervening. It's also used by an organization in the US called the Arbor Day Foundation. They operate worldwide, but they're one of the biggest tree planting organizations. They do a lot of work on the ground. And I think what's great about that is, so now you have this map, right, that shows you areas of nature deficit. So we know, okay, these areas could be because you're much better off planting trees in an area that doesn't have a lot of greenery than you are planting more greenery in an area that does already have a lot of greenery, right? The benefits for public health and well-being and safety are going to be a lot greater in that area that doesn't have any. But they have the map that can show you where to target your efforts, but it's very, very, very critical, the most critical, to then again zoom in beyond the ground and work in the local context, because we need to be very wary that we don't just drop trees from the sky and say this will solve all your problems. Like, you need to be very, very wary of what's happening on the ground. And no one has done this research better than Dr. Christine Carmichael. And she's done incredible research. I read about it in the book, about this very well-intentioned greening organization that went into the city of Detroit, that they went in and they found that 25% of the residents in this neighborhood actually submitted a no tree request, saying they didn't want a tree, because there was a whole history of the municipality coming in, planting trees, not taking care of them, and it being a real danger and a real maintenance issue for those residents. So none of this is going to work if you don't have community buy-in. And I will say, because you mentioned, Angela, Sugi Project at the beginning, they're a fantastic initiative that has done really, really great work at really getting that community buy-in and starting small with these tiny forests, following this Miyawaki method. And I think that's really incredible, because yes, technology can help you determine where would be most effective, but ultimately it's the community and the residents on the ground that are going to have it be a make or break for success, and make sure it's something that they want in their own neighborhood.
Great, thank you for that. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time to take more questions, so I'm just gonna wrap up because we're on at 3 p.m. So as we draw this event to a close, I just want to express my sincere gratitude to Nadina for sharing her expertise and insights with us today. Really inspired by her book and the Internet of Nature, and I hope it provides everyone with a bit more insights and food for thought. So I'm going to hand over to Kat to wrap up the event.
And I will just add, Angela, for anyone that had a pressing question that we weren't able to get to, you're welcome to email me, nadina@nadinagalle.com, or there's a contact form on my website, and I'd be happy to answer it over email for you.
We've actually listed out all the questions in a doc, Nadina, so we can send.
Oh, wonderful.
Send it to you and get your feedback and comments on that.
That's even more consolidated. Wonderful.
So yeah, over to you, Kat, to wrap us up.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, so before we end the session, we'd like to announce who we're giving the book away to. So we appreciate all of your insightful questions. And as like Angela and Nadina mentioned, we're gonna bring them together, get Nadina to answer them, and then we'll send them out to everyone after the session. It'll probably be in the next couple of days or so. So it was really hard to pick just one. but we did a random selection, and we want to congratulate Bradford Roar. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. So we'll be in touch after the event to arrange for you to receive your copy of The Nature of Our Cities. So if you leave like your email address, or I think we might have it actually with the registration, we'll get in touch with you. Special thanks to our speaker today, Nadina, for an engaging discussion. Thank you to everyone who joined today. We hope you find it really insightful and really helpful, and you got some tips out of it as well. If you can spare a few minutes, please take a few moments to give us your feedback. It really helps us to improve and shape our future events to support the wider community. You can scan the QR code that's on the screen now, or just follow the link that I think Ben has put in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. And I hope you have a nice rest of the day and week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nadina.